Breitbart News Sunday is now very pleased to welcome a special guest from South Africa. He is Rob Hersov. He's one of the most influential commentators in South Africa on current events. He's a businessman as well as being an author, and he travels the world. I've caught up with him after his returns from Dubai, from London. He's now in Cape Town, South Africa, and we welcome him to Breitbart News Sunday. Rob, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Joel. I'm in sunny, beautiful Cape Town.
Well, I'm jealous. We're still digging out here from rain-soaked Los Angeles, where the fires have denuded the hillsides, and now many of them seem to be running into the sea. We had a few firefighters washed off the road and into the ocean. They had to extricate themselves. So the weather here is not good at all, but we'll dream of sunnier days. Speaking of Cape Town, how does the present situation look from there with regard to the United States? We have seen our president, Donald Trump, take South Africa to task. He's now in his fourth week of the presidency, and he has been quite stern in terms of relations with South Africa. How do things look from your perspective?
So I think what he's doing is absolutely right, and I'm surprised it took the United States so long to notice that our ANC government, which has been in power since 1994, when we had our first democratic elections, our ANC government has been virulently anti-West and particularly anti-American. And I think South Africa is in the top 5 countries of voting against U.S. interests in the United Nations over the last 10 years. South Africa takes aid from the United States. The ANC government takes what it can get and pokes the bear in the eye, the American bear, or the American eagle in the eye, I should say. And I'm not surprised Donald Trump's doing what he's doing, and I personally welcome it. Our government, the ANC government, is forcing a socialist, quasi-communist agenda down onto the throats of South Africans. And over 30 years, if you look at every single metric of when the ANC inherited this country and a sophisticated economy at the time, if you look at every metric, health, education, employment, electricity provision, it has gone backwards in every single metric. This ANC government in 30 years has destroyed our economy. And it's reaching a break point. And we're not going to fix it internally. We need to either precipitate a crisis, or we need an external factor to try and change the dynamic. And that external factor, I think, is the United States and Donald Trump's government. So I thank the Americans for actually noticing what's going on here. And who knows where it'll take us, though.
So your perspective is not one that people typically hear from South Africa. We saw President Cyril Ramaphosa saying that President Trump had been taken in by misinformation. We saw many other responses that were angry, outraged. The cartoonist Jonathan Shapiro, otherwise known as Shapiro, drew Trump as Adolf Hitler and Elon Musk as, I suppose, one of the members of the SS, which is, of course, insulting, but that seems to be the prevailing view in South Africa's mainstream media. You're offering a different view. Do many South Africans share your view, and why is it that those views don't bubble to the surface?
Anyone who believes in liberty, freedom, the pursuit of happiness, and the crucial importance of property rights will be thinking and speaking the way I do. South Africa is absolutely on the edge of the abyss, and it's entirely down to ANC policy. But what has happened is, you have the never Trumpers in the left. The evil woke mind virus has spread heavily to South Africa. And the magazine you mentioned, Daily Maverick, with, I call him a wanky lefty. I think I can say that on your show, Shapiro, who I used to rate as a cartoonist. They're just so left-wing. They can't see what Trump and America is doing for what it is. It's an opportunity to disrupt the narrative in South Africa, which we can't do internally. And then the ANC government are so caught up in their leftist thinking, their socialist indoctrination that they're forcing upon this country, that they think BRICS will come and rescue them. The Russians, Chinese, and Iranians. Iran has been paying the ANC to challenge Israel in the ICJ. They think the BRICS countries are going to ride to their rescue. They're not.
So let's talk about BRICS for a second. The I in BRICS stands for India, and India's President Narendra Modi was in the United States this past week, and he had a very cordial meeting with President Trump. And India is very close to the United States, even if it's also close to Russia. India never cut Russia off from international trade the way President Joe Biden wanted countries to do. Of course, India, being the world's largest democracy, has a special relationship with the United States. But is BRICS the threat to the dominance of the US dollar that President Trump seems to think it is?
It's a minor threat, not a major threat. The only threat to America is China, militarily, technologically, and I wouldn't say culturally, but geographically. That's the only threat. And I do think Donald Trump is trying to put aside all the other problems in the world so he can focus his attention on China. And he's right. But from a South African perspective, South Africa shouldn't even be in BRICS. I mean, the S on the end of BRICS is supposed to stand for South Africa, but South Africa is irrelevant. And within BRICS, you have democracies like India and Brazil, and you have, lunatic countries like Russia and China. And I just don't see BRICS ever getting its act together to seriously threaten America. The only possible threat is to de-dollarize everything they're doing. And I do think Trump is right in defending the dollar. So BRICS is a mishmash of disconnected countries, democracies, actually countries that tend to be pro-West, pro-America. I don't see BRICS really mounting a threat, but it's not a bad thing for America to crack the whip now and pull the Indias and maybe Brazil's and more likely Saudi Arabia out of that BRICS and back towards America and the West.
Okay, so let's focus on China. So you have an international perspective, not just in South Africa, but you have a sense of the business world more broadly. How does China's influence make itself felt in South Africa? And would you say that China is succeeding in South Africa to an extent, perhaps, that it isn't in other parts of the world? Or is it more successful in South Africa than it has been elsewhere?
Yes, because the ANC are easy to bribe. China's bribing them. And there's an open book in South Africa for whatever China wants in terms of minerals, metals, rare earths, and access to the ports. South Africa, if I was an American, I'd go, why should we even care about South Africa? Why should we even care about Africa? We can get minerals and metals anywhere else. We actually can probably get them from Alaska, and I think it's Arkansas or Alabama have discovered rare earths. So America is self-sufficient and can sort itself out without Africa, but there is still a strategic element on the South African ports. And if you look at the Chagos Islands that are being handed over in a most moronic way by the British government to the Chinese, and you link that to the South China Sea, and then you link that to Cape Town port, you're giving the Chinese Belt and Road concept real power in the Indian Ocean, and that's not a good thing.
What about some of the other strategic ports? You mentioned Cape Town. Simonstown has been the focus of the South African Navy for decades, and it has been fought over by empires dating back to Napoleon and the British in the early 19th century. What do you think will transpire there? I mean, is China really intending to move in there, and is there anything the rest of the world can do about it?
So I think the big stick against South Africa in saying, we've had enough of you voting against us, treating us, taking our money and doing nothing for us, and then allying with Russia, China, and Iran, we've had enough. So if America withdrawing aid is one thing, absolutely. Aid is a gift. It's not an obligation. But going further than that and placing sanctions, tariffs, and even targeting, which I hope America will do. So target the whole leadership of the EFF, the leadership of MK. There's some very nasty people who've been shouting, kill the Boer, kill the whites. It's all public knowledge. If America can go that far, I think the ANC will bend the knee. And I think it is necessary now to make them bend the knee, because BRICS is not going to ride to their rescue. And China's not going to look for another fight. China knows the big fight's coming, the big arm wrestle's coming with America. America's putting aside Russia. America's probably going to let Israel sort out Iran, which I would support, whatever that means, in a meaningful way. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity, but I think China's not going to want to get into a fight with America on South Africa. So there's, I think, an open door for America to, let's not say reclaim South Africa, but pull South Africa back towards the West and have the ANC bend the knee.
That's very interesting. So you think that China might be willing to back away given the right kinds of pressure?
Absolutely.
Now, I've heard criticism from some in the South African opposition who have said that Trump, by criticizing South Africa and cutting off aid, has actually pushed the ANC and the EFF, the economic freedom fighters. They fight for the opposite of economic freedom. They're sort of Venezuela-style communists, if you will. But he's pushed them closer together, and there's a risk that it undermines the opposition project in South Africa, which is to grow the political alternative to the ANC. So some people in the opposition are not too happy with Trump's confrontational tone. What would you say to that?
I'd say they're just scared. This new government, so for the American viewers and listeners, for the first time ever in 2024, the ANC fell below 50%. So for 30 years, they've had over 50%. They've ruled this country or misruled this country on their own for 30 years. They fell to 41% and were forced to create a coalition government, but called the Government of National Unity, GNU. But it's not even a coalition. They didn't have a mission statement. So at the ANC at 41, the Democratic Alliance, which is the kind of pro-democracy, pro-free enterprise opposition at 21%, and then added in a whole lot of smaller parties. And that's been alive since May. So they've had 7 months, and they're trying to make it work. But socialist policies are being pushed through at an even rapid or more rapid rate under the GNU and rubber stamped by the GNU members who are not ANC. It's ludicrous. It's actually getting worse under the GNU. And the only aim of this GNU government seems to be to keep the very hardcore left, MK and EFF, out of power. That seems to be the only, there's no talk about economic growth or solving any of our problems. And that's the main aim of this government. So with America coming in and, with a potential baseball bat, the GNU members are huddling together to saying, how do we hold this very new, it's not a coalition, but combined government together? And what they have to do is stand up and say, we're going to have to stand on our own 2 feet and face up to America. But it's ludicrous. I'd rather have the non-ANC members like Gayton McKenzie, John Steenhuisen, and others actually break ranks and say, we need to bend the knee. We cannot alienate America. We need to listen to their demands and backtrack on some of the terrible legislation, Joel, that you know only too well, has been pushed through in the last few weeks. I'll just name one of them: expropriation without compensation. And even though some of the opposition members say, well, it's not as bad as it sounds. If you read the terms, there's some form of, buyer-seller conversation. Just the title, expropriation without compensation. What it is a loaded gun being left in the bedroom with children running around. At some point, a kid's going to pick up the gun and pull the trigger. And that's what has been implemented. And there are 140 race-based laws in South Africa, anti-white laws. And this is the straw that broke the camel's back.
I think from an American perspective, the term bend the knee is not one I think Americans would want to use. I think from Trump's perspective, it's probably telling South Africa to stand up finally and stop bending the knee to China or to socialism or whatever. But obviously there are some bright spots in South Africa. I mean, you're in Cape Town. Cape Town is quite well run, certainly relative to the rest of South Africa. And I was in South Africa a couple of years ago. If you drive around the roads in northern South Africa, Limpopo province, it's more pothole than road. But if you drive even in the country around Cape Town, the Western Cape, the roads are very good and the infrastructure is pretty good. The people in Cape Town take the bus to work. It's fairly safe. So where would you say there are centers of excellence? I mean, I've named Cape Town as a geographic center, but talk about perhaps some of the areas of the South African economy that could be a basis for future growth.
So the Cape is one province, not just Cape Town, but the Western Cape province is run by the opposition party, the Democratic Alliance. So it says it all. You know, the Democratic Alliance can run South Africa. ANC cannot. Very clear. But there are centers of excellence. You know, South Africa is one of the greatest tourist destinations in the world. I've traveled the world. I've lived in the States. I've lived in Europe. There is no place like, I'm not going to say home, there's no place like South Africa as a tourist destination. The entrepreneurial abilities of South Africans is second to none. I believe there are 25 South African-born dollar billionaires in America. You know, Elon Musk, everyone knows, but Patrick Soon-Shiong, I believe, is the second wealthiest person in Los Angeles, is South African-born. And I can go on and on and on and on and mention them. So, you know, the talent here is second to none. And the infrastructure, even though it's broken, can be fixed. If we had a Damascene moment in South Africa, if we had somebody step up with leadership qualities, you know, would want to hope it would be the Democratic Alliance, but maybe it's a Gayton McKenzie, who's an interesting character, who stood up and said, this is not working. This is not going in the right direction. I will do a Javier Milei on this country. We could get to 3 to 4% economic growth in 12 months. And foreign direct investment would once again consider South Africa as an investment destination. But we would have to focus on property rights, free enterprise, deregulation, and a pro-West approach. But there's no one at the moment who's putting their hand up to do that or say that.
Talk for a minute about crime. The experience of ordinary street crime in South Africa can be quite difficult, although Cape Town is, again, relatively safe. But other kinds of crime pose a problem for industrial supply chains. For example, when I was looking at the problem of electricity generation in South Africa, because there have been some electricity shortages, I was surprised to learn that criminal syndicates have taken over the supply routes, basically, between coal mines and coal plants. It doesn't just arrive on a train anymore. You have to go through several middlemen who each take their cut, and by the time the coal gets to the plant, if it reaches the plant, it's already too expensive to burn efficiently because of all the criminals basically along the way. How do you unravel that problem?
So, you know, the mafia could really learn a trick or two by coming to South Africa. The ANC has perfected corruption, not just at the lower level, but at the highest level. They appointed what was called cadres, which was an official policy voted for in, I think, 2005, and Cyril Ramaphosa, our current president, was in the room, where they appoint cadres, or cadres, C-A-D-R-E, into positions of power and influence, but positions where people control budgets. And then they were able to redirect the budgets to their friends, to middlemen, and it effectively destroyed the economy. South African Airways used to be the best airline in Africa. It doesn't exist anymore. It became an employment
I remember
agency.
People used to take South African Airways from New York direct to South Africa. Yeah, it was a big...
And there are all sorts of mafias. The word is correctly used. So in Eskom, our Electricity Supply Commission, as you correctly point out, there was a cable mafia, the diesel mafia, the coal mafia. And these are people or groups that interceded themselves in between a system to redirect funds or redirect product. And a simple example is the following. If you break a turbine in an electricity generation plant and South Africa is short of power, there has to be an emergency importing of diesel at great cost. There was the diesel mafia. It was in their interest to put inferior coal through a turbine, break the turbine, so that they could make money importing diesel. And if you extrapolate that across every single industry, there's a construction mafia, you know, they would basically hold you at ransom, employees even turn up at work. So the criminality is an industry. And it's not just, you know, you've got to lock your gates and have security and watch out for your family. Not that sort of necessarily crime, which exists. Crime is an industry in South Africa.
A great challenge, because it's not just about arresting people on the street, but really about going after the networks. Does South Africa have the capacity to do it? Suppose everything turned around, you had a new government. Would it be difficult for the new government to go after the networks that have infiltrated themselves into so many different areas of the South African economy?
Not that difficult. If there's a will, there's a way. With the right leader, the results will flow. But we don't have the right leader. We have a government run by the ANC that is a kleptocratic organization. It's in their interest to break things so they can steal. In a fully functioning democracy and economy, it's difficult to steal. But when things fall apart, it's very easy to steal. So they break so they can steal. It's malevolence and incompetence together. It's sickening.
So do you think that the present confrontation with Donald Trump can actually help generate the political will for change in South Africa?
I do. But I think it needs to be significantly greater, the pressure. I think it needs to be not just strategic, but tactical. And the tactics need to include, and now I'm going to really push the boat out, there needs to be on the terrorist list or on the red list, on the no travel list, on the closed bank account list, all the leaders of the EFF, MK, and quite frankly, I would add all the members of the GNU government, unless they stand up and call for a new direction. This is a big call. This is saying put Cyril Ramaphosa, the DA members, the Patriotic Alliance people in government on that list too, unless they back down and start reversing some of this destructive policy that they're putting in place. I'd go much harder.
There's a lot of talk about AGOA, which is the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which expires in September. It's a trade deal that gives preferential treatment to a group of African countries in terms of access to the American market. South Africa has been warned that it risks being kicked out of AGOA, and AGOA may not be renewed anyway. What do you see as the context of that dispute? Because on the one hand, the whole trade deal could be thrown out. On the other hand, it could be perhaps renewed, renegotiated. But then there's a question of South Africa's place in it, because the terms of the current deal say that any country that operates against U.S. interests can actually be excluded. And there are many people in the United States, including Democrats, not just Republicans, who have said that South Africa's alliance with Russia, for example, which really irked the Democrats, should result in South Africa being excluded from those benefits. How do you see that? I'm
surprised South Africa is still allowed to be in AGOA. I mean, I do believe America is going to cancel it. I really do. Here's the problem. A lot of these measures, cancellation of these kind of agreements, tariffs, and then maybe sanctions, will really hurt our economy, will hurt our business community, will further impoverish people. But we're still heading down the abyss. Unless there's a crisis, a precipitation of a crisis, which this could create, we're never going to get people in power to stand up and say, this is not working, we need to change direction. We are the frogs being boiled in the pot. And I tell you right now, the temperature's just got too high and something needs to happen. And maybe this is what we need, a crisis. And I'm not going to be very popular for saying this, but it's the truth.
Do you think that there are ways through this crisis that could lead to a brighter future and better relations between South Africa and the United States?
Here's what worries me. In 1985, before the ANC came in, which was 94, in 1985, the national government, the apartheid government, had their Damascene moment because the West, led by America, imposed significant sanctions and tariffs on our country. And that government sat around the table, looked at each other in the eyes and said, this is not sustainable. We need to change direction. And that was the beginning of the end of apartheid. The ANC didn't win a war. The ANC won nothing. It was the Nat government said, this can't go on. We need to change direction. My worry, if you see 2025 as our 1985, our Damascene moment, is the ANC government do not care about the country. The Nats at least said, the country's going to suffer. All people of all shapes and sizes are going to suffer. We can't go on. I don't think the ANC care. They just care about stealing for their leaders and their elites, and they really don't care what happens to the country. So this may precipitate a crisis.
Is there enough of an alternative then that could step up, or even dissident members of the ANC? Because as you mentioned, there were people in the National Party during apartheid who also came forward and said we have to change. And even if they didn't come forward publicly, they did so privately. They met with Nelson Mandela in prison. Are there people in South Africa who can build a strong enough coalition for change?
Yes, there is. But we need some of the ANC to, to realize that it can't go on and to come to the middle and meet those people. They do exist. My worry is probably Elon Musk's comment 3 weeks ago to someone. They asked him, Elon, do you even care about South Africa? Should America even care? And he, when he goes quiet and he thinks and you see the cogs moving, and his answer was 3 words: demographics don't lie. If you take the EFF, MK, and ANC voting numbers, it's 66% of the voting population that would vote for a hardcore left, communist, or socialist organization. Demographics don't lie. So,
well, I'm reminded, it's an interesting number,
worrying.
66%. I'm reminded I was in South Africa 20 or 25 years ago, and someone was saying that they had hosted a radio show in the early 1990s when the constitutional changes were being discussed in South Africa, and 2-1, so basically 66%, 2-1, the callers to the radio show were against change. But when they went out and voted, it was exactly the opposite. So who knows? I mean, people, I think if they are shown a way forward, can give it a chance. In this country, Donald Trump received a higher share of the minority vote, that is from Black and Hispanic voters, than any Republican ever had, and that's by campaigning against racial preferences. He received a majority of the votes of Latino men, which just caught Democrats completely by surprise. So people are able, I think, as you point out, with the right leadership to change their minds and step forward. Rob Hersov, thanks so much for joining us on Breitbart News Sunday. Tell us where we can follow your commentary and your views.
Thank you, Joel. Firstly, I only set up a YouTube channel 10 days ago. So it's and I went on to X 3 weeks ago. So you can follow me on X, you can follow me on YouTube, but it's a very recent thing.
People have been sending me clips of your shows and commentary, so you must have been making a name for yourself on other people's shows. So you're starting out on your own. So it's Rob Hersov, Hersov, if you want to search for Rob's name on YouTube or on X. But you have some really interesting things to say, some incisive commentary. So we wish you luck. I'm sure much of what you say will be of interest both to South Africans, but also to an American audience. Thanks so much for joining us on Breitbart News Sunday.
Thank you, Joel.